It's an unsettling passage, is it not? It's one of those passages, I think, that as you're reading it, it makes you shift in your seat a little bit. It's one of those passages that makes us uncomfortable. The context doesn't do much to help us because Jesus is speaking to a bunch of people. He's talking about his ministry, and he's talking about the reactions to his ministry. Jesus is beginning to get some momentum. He's getting some early successes. He's an up-and-coming. He might be on Christianity Today's list of people and preachers to watch. He's really moving up in the world, and yet he tells a story about rejection, about how the people are going to reject his message, and only a few are going to hear it. And the thing that causes more concern is that these were the people that if anybody was going to have ears to hear, if anyone was going to be the people who would see, it would have been those who Jesus was speaking to. It would have been them. These were God's covenant people. These all were people. They were the children of Abraham. They were those who had been led out by the Exodus. They were those who had been led by the pillar of fire and the cloud. They were those who had been delivered. They had those who God had made a covenant with. Those whom God had sent prophets to. Those people who continued to worship in the temple. If anyone was going to be those who would hear and understand, it certainly would be them. And yet Jesus tells a story about rejection. Jesus says most of the people who are going to hear my message are going to reject it. And for us, same is true. If anyone was going to have ears to hear and eyes to see, certainly it would be us. Gathered here on a Sunday morning, certainly it would be us who have come here to hear the Word of God, who've given up our time. Certainly we would be the ones, right? We would be the people who would have eyes to see and ears to hear. It's why it's so unsettling. Because Jesus speaks directly to us. He speaks directly to those people who feel comfortable. And so the question comes to us as we're here this morning, how do we become good soil? How do we become those type of people with ears to hear, with eyes to see, and who understand the message of Jesus? How do we become those who see Jesus? Let's look at each of these soils and see if it can tell us something about how to become good soil. First, we see the path in verse 4. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. This most directly refers to the Pharisees. Jesus is talking about the Pharisees. The image is pretty simple. If you've ever walked a well-trod path, it's no longer even dirt or soil anymore. It feels solid. It's impenetrable. It's walking along a path that the seed cannot even penetrate the surface of. It refers to the Pharisees. They have no interest at all in what Jesus is really selling. Their shields are completely up. They're like water hitting a stone is Jesus' words on their hearts. It bounces off. They have no interest at all. They're completely comfortable with where they are, and they reject Jesus. They've come to see what he's all about, and they've decided they don't want any part of it. Why? I mean, certainly you would think these would be the people who would be excited about God doing something in the world. Certainly the Pharisees would be the ones, right? Verse 14, Jesus says, "You will indeed hear, never understand. You will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's hearts have grown dull." Their hearts have grown dull. Literally, the word there, dull, means fat. Their hearts have grown fat. The idea is that their hearts are encased in fat. It's impenetrable. You can't even get to their hearts through all the fat. And it makes sense, does it not? It makes sense. One commentator says their hearts are satiated. Their hearts are full of something other. And it makes sense. These are the powerful people. These are the well-to-do people in the society. These are the people who are pretty comfortable with things as they are and as they stand. And so when Jesus comes around and he starts talking about good news, he starts talking about a kingdom where the meek are going to inherit the earth, where things are going to change, where the things are going to be turned upside down, the people who are powerful and are comfortable with the way that things are, the people who see everything as going, actually things are going okay, Jesus. Why do you need to upset the apple cart? Why do you need to come around here with all this talk of a new kingdom? Everything's going okay. The Romans aren't so bad. The economy is stimulated. Things are okay. We don't need any good news. What need do we have of good news? You see, it's very difficult when life is going very well for you to imagine that the world might need to change. I don't know about you, it's one of the hardest things for me in evangelism. I find that I can do evangelism quite well to those who are hurting and suffering. That those people are quite open to the possibility that God might be doing something in the world, that things might be about to change, that the meek might be about to inherit the earth. But those who are comfortable, those whose lives are pretty decent, not that they don't have trouble, but they're comfortable in their life as it is, they seem things are pretty good, those are the ones that it's very difficult to evangelize to. It's very difficult to talk about Jesus because they say, good news, what? I have good news already. The stock market is up. I just got a promotion. Beachfront property is on the rise. Everything seems to be going well, and this is exactly those types of people. They have no need of good news. They're very happy with the status quo, and so the good news of the gospel bounces off. Have you ever had a conversation with someone and you just knew they weren't listening to you? Like, have you ever had a conversation with someone and you just knew, like, they were clearly waiting for the moment that they could either leave the conversation or they already had in their mind what they were going to say and were just waiting for the break in the conversation so that way they could get what their point was out? Have you ever had that? Some of you are smirking, so I'm assuming that the answer is yes. You've had that experience before. This is exactly what Jesus is encountering. Jesus is proclaiming the kingdom, and already all they're thinking of is all the reasons why they're not going to reject it. All the reasons they're going to push it aside. This is the hard-hearted. This is the seed that falls along the path. But it gets worse. Verses 5 and 6. Jesus says, other seed fell on rocky ground. They did not have much soil, and immediately they sprung up, since there was no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. Since they had no root, they withered away. There's a contrast here. Immediately, there's an appearance of growth. Things seem to be going quite well. This is what you want. You have your prayer meeting, you have your evangelistic outreach, you have something like that, and there appears some seed. You might be thinking there might be a great harvest coming. But just under the surface, it never takes root. The image that Jesus is giving in the ancient world, you might, instead of finding a path, which was hard on the top, there was a very thin layer of topsoil, maybe 2 to 3 inches deep, that you would try to sow the seed into. But underneath that, about 3 inches deep, was limestone. And so you could scatter the seed and it would spring up ever so slightly in that. But as its roots tried to go down deep, as it tried to really establish itself, as it tried to really get down into the soil, it would meet opposition. And it would quickly wither away and die. The gospel never really takes hold. It never really goes down deep. It never really establishes itself. Have you ever talked to someone and you ask them, how are you doing? And they always say, fine. For years, fine. I'm good, fine. How are you doing? Fine. Fine. And you get to the point eventually and you wonder, are we ever going to get past this point in our relationship? Are we ever going to get past that sort of place where you just respond with the kind of nicety of fine? You just are we ever going to get past those pleasant niceties of friendship and really talk about each other and who we are? Are we ever going to really get to that place? One of the things we talk about in RUF is this phrase we've adopted is we should talk more. And one of the things that we mean is we should talk more often, but we should talk more deeply also. Because if the gospel is going to go down deep, it's going to have to go down into some uncomfortable places. It's going to have to penetrate our hearts and actually take root very deep. And it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to be difficult. But if the gospel is going to take root, we got to get past those pleasant niceties. We got to let it go down deep into places we're nervous about. Does anybody in here do you have a junk room? You got junk room? Maybe you're very organized. You have a junk drawer because your house is better organized than mine. I have a junk room. Maybe you're like, hey, listen, it's been a rough year. You've got 2 junk rooms. You just got like the 2 guest bedrooms. You've got your room, and then there's like 2 other bedrooms. You're like, both of those are junk. I'm not here to judge, But you got these junk rooms, and you got people who are gonna come over, right? People are gonna come visit, and so what you do is you just put everything that you don't know what to do with, all the kind of stuff that's accumulated over the years, all the kind of things that doesn't really have a place, but you can't get rid of it, so you just kind of throw it in this junk room and you close the door, right? You close the door and you just say to, whoever's coming, hey, just stay in the front of the house. The bathroom is down the hall, and that's the only place you need to go. And don't go in those other rooms, right? Because it's very easy when you're having a guest. We can kind of keep people in the front, keep them where it's safe. I don't want you to see all my mess and everything. You're a guest. When Jesus comes over to our house, Jesus does not want to be a guest. When the gospel comes in, Jesus does not come in and say, I want to be a guest. No, he says, I want to live in this place. I want to live in this place. And if Jesus is going to move in, you know what Jesus likes to do is he always walks in and he goes, what's in that room over there? And you're saying, no, Jesus, we've got the wine is up here, Jesus. We've got the appetizers and the hors d'oeuvres. Everything's up here. Why don't you just come and stay right here? And he said, no. If the gospel is going to go down deep, if I'm going to really live in this place, I got to go figure out what's in there. I got to go find where the junk is. That's what it means for the gospel to sink down deep into our lives. It looks like letting Jesus into some really uncomfortable places. That's where he longs to go. It gets worse even still. Verse 7, other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Like before, there's some growth. There's some appearance of fruit. It even springs up. It seems like they're growing up. There's some time that passes, but there's little to show at the end. J.C. Ryle, a great commentator on the Gospels, he says it like this. People who are like these weeds, they like Jesus. They like Jesus. They know the truth. And one day hope to be dedicated Christians. But they never come to the point of giving it all up for Christ. They like Jesus, and one day hope to be dedicated Christians. But they never come to the point of giving it all up for Christ. Friends, don't put Jesus on your New Year's resolutions. Don't put Christianity on your to-do list. Say, yeah, that's very, very nice. I know that would probably be good. I know that would be something that would be very good for me, that Christianity, that Jesus thing. I really ought to take that more seriously, But I'm just a little busy right now. Things are a little tense. I'll get to that eventually. I'll get over to that one day. One day I'll handle that. I'll touch base with Jesus in the future. But right now things are a little busy. I'm not sure I've got time. I moved into a new house when we came here, and we bought the house, and we have these wonderful butterfly kind of I don't know what they're called, butterfly attracting bushes in the front of the house. It was very nice. These butterflies will come, and you kind of sit there, and my wife loves to have her coffee and sit there and watch the butterflies in the morning. It's very nice. And so we moved in and bought this house, and you're kind of trying to get everything situated. And so my family came, in-laws and family and such come to the house. And as in-laws and family do, they pointed out that one of these bushes was completely covered in weeds. A giant vine had kind of taken over the top of the bushes. And I certainly appreciated, as I was moving into the house, that they would point that out to me. It was very nice. And so I did what a good husband does. I put it off for a little while. And then I eventually got out there and decided, okay, I'm gonna tackle these weeds. Because my thought was, I could see these butterfly plants were sort of just peeking through the weeds. They were sort of just coming out. And I thought, if I just pull these weeds off, these bushes are really gonna flourish. These are really gonna come in, and then Abby's gonna be real happy. We're gonna have this beautiful kind of front area, and this is gonna be wonderful. And so I'm out there, and the weeds are so much more so much thicker than I thought they were. I'm pulling off weed after weed. And as I'm pulling the weeds off, I'm pulling branches from the bush because it's so intertwined. And I'm trying to find the roots, and I can't. And then I think I've killed it, and then there's another one, and over and over and over again. And by the time I was done, I realized I basically pulled almost the entire plant out with it. I basically pulled the bush out entirely. When I pulled it off, what I realized was those little things that I saw coming through were just an illusion. The plant was totally dead, and I had to start over. It had just become scaffolding for weeds. And friends, if we're not careful, what we can do is we can let the seed of the gospel plant and then let something else sit in our hearts. And for a while, those things can grow, and they can both seem to be doing fine. You can say, aha, I see. These things can coexist, can they not? Right? I can have this and this. But if the gospel is going to sink down deep, if it's going to really bear fruit in our lives, some things are going to have to die for the gospel to live. And whatever that thing is for you, I don't know, but it's probably the thing that you're thinking right now. You're thinking, I know what that is, but I don't really want to give it up. But I don't really want to give it up. Whatever that thing is probably the thing. Probably. If the gospel is going to take root, some things will have to die. J.C. Ryle again, he says this. He says, there is no part of the whole parable more important than this. We must never be content with barren orthodoxy, with a cold maintenance of correct theological views. We must never be satisfied with clear knowledge, warm feelings, and a decent profession. We must see to it that the gospel we profess to love produces positive fruit in our hearts and lives. This is real Christianity. We must see to it that the gospel we profess to love produces positive fruit in our hearts and lives. This is real Christianity. So how do we become good soil? Now that we're thoroughly depressed. How do we become good soil? How do we become those that hear and that see? Do we just leave this place and go home and work really hard? Right? Go pull out your to-do list of all the weeds that you need to get out, all the rocks that need to come out of your life. Is that what you need to do? I don't think that's what Jesus is getting at. There's a difference, Jesus says, between verses 14 and 15 and then verse 16. There's a transition here. So you say in verses 14 to 15, you will indeed hear but never understand. You will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their eyes they can barely hear, or with their ears they can barely hear, and with their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. That's the first three soils. But, Jesus says, blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. I don't know if you've noticed this in the Gospels. The disciples do not always come off looking great. This is one of the few places where Jesus commends the disciples. Most of the time, Jesus is coming to the disciples and say, how slow of heart are you to believe? How long do I have to be with you for you to understand? Why do what is wrong with you people? Is most of the time Jesus is exacerbated. But here, with the disciples, he says, but blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. What's the difference? Look what verse 10. Then the disciples came to him and said, why do you speak to them in parables? The disciples are just as confused as you and I. The disciples are just as confused as everybody else. The disciples are not sure what Jesus is up to, but in the midst of all these people who thought they were part of God's kingdom, all these people were reacting to Jesus. They're the only ones who had the wherewithal and the humility to go to Jesus and to ask. To go to him and say, Jesus, we don't understand. Would you speak to us? Would you show us? Would you open our eyes that we might see? Would you open our ears that we might hear? What makes the disciples different is they have the humility to go and ask. And then Jesus says, blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. And then what does Jesus do? He explains the parable to them. The disciples weren't superheroes. They weren't spiritual bodybuilders. They weren't amazing at everything. They weren't over the top. What the disciples knew was they had the humility to come and they had the humility to ask. They're humble enough to admit they don't understand. Humble enough to admit that they need grace. Friends, the gospel is not just a beautiful picture of sacrifice and God's love for us. It is that. But the gospel is also a full-on siege. It's an assault on human pride. It's an assault on our self-reliance. It's an assault on our ability to do it ourselves. Because the gospel comes to us and it says, you are not able to do this on your own. But you can see and you can hear and you can understand if you're humble enough to ask. If you're humble enough to come to Jesus and say, Lord, would you show me? That's how we become good soil, not by bringing out our to-do list, not by doing all sorts of different things, but coming to Jesus and admitting that we can't and that we need him to come and take up residence in our lives. We need him to bring the gospel and let it sink down deep into our hearts. John Calvin, the great theologian, says this, that seeing of which Christ now speaks has been enjoyed by believers in every age in common with the apostles. We do not see Christ, and yet we see him. We do not hear Christ, and yet we hear him. For in the gospel we behold him. In the gospel we behold him, in the word of God. As you go to Jesus, as you come to his word and say, Lord, would you open my eyes that I might see? You can behold Christ. You can see him. As we come to the table, you can behold Christ. Let's pray.